Hello, greetings, and welcome, my dear listeners. My name is Heretical Hatter, and I welcome you to now 13th episode of my little series, The Tau Empire Reimagined. And today we will be continuing the history of the Fifth Coalition War, this time talking about the Southern Front, which was far more bloody and on bigger scale than the Northern conflict we talked about last time. For the sake of saving time, there won't be any narration elements in this video. I apologize, but I made some calculations and I decided that cutting things short this time will be more efficient. Either way, I hope you will enjoy this episode, and if you do leave like, subscribe, ring a bell, the whole shtick. I know that some of you are cringing right now because another YouTuber asking for subscribers and likes and comments and other things. But this is the main way how to make connections with my viewers. There's already over 100 of us in terms of subscribers, for which I am very grateful, and I will do my best to make more and interesting videos. In fact, I have something in the works that I hope will be to your liking. If everything goes well, or as I hope it will, in between this series, which is a total rewrite of the Tau Empire lore, and my idea for rewrite of Damocles Gulf Crusade, there will be a nutshell series. This will be mostly directed to newcomers, where in very compact video I will be talking about entirety of the lore of the Tauva Coalition, and dedicated video for every single species of the Coalition, which should be great introduction to the Damocles Gulf Crusade, because I also have plans to explore the preparations of the Imperium of Man for this great crusade. We are already quite far in my document about the lore, about the coalition, so I want to speed things up a little bit for us to reach the moment when I can go into this smaller nutshell series and the Damocles Gulf Crusade itself. So, with all my mumbling and organizational talk for the future out of the way, please, my darling, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of the Southern Front of the Fifth Coalition War. The Southern War was led by half-mad orc known as Warlord Mad Murda. He led a significant amount of vessels, many of which had potential rivals on board. This war would crash into the Council space and new member of species of the Coalition, before spreading out in every direction, causing extreme damage and chaos. This war wouldn't stay together for a long time. Numerous orc fleets would go towards their own targets, which broke their power, but also forced Coalition to spread out their forces. Soon, Coalition would be forced to deal with multiple competing warlords who wanted to take over the war and create their own orc empires. This front also bore witness to multiple strange phenomena which would remain a mystery to the Coalition for generations to come. First stage of the war. Dispersed arrival. 4800 to 4809. Just like in the North and in the Third Coalition War, Orcs arrived without any clear cohesion. Warlord Mad Murda wouldn't arrive all the way to 4810, both distance and the warp making the arrival of Orcs far more dispersed in nature, and initially at least, far easier to handle. The arriving fleets were splitting and going in different directions. They also raised to action small Orc forces that remained from the time of Third Coalition War, slowly growing in power and size. Orcs used already secured worlds to establish points of build-up for their forces. Numerous war bosses were creating their own bands and small territories, without leading Orc warlord. Coalition Navy attempted to counter the Orcs, but the influence of the Green Menace quickly spread out in all directions. Very wide front and the Orcs attacking both Coalition and unknown species in the region made countering them in any reliable way close to impossible. The Coalition did score some victories, but with Orcs being dispersed on such wide front, they had no way to eliminate Orcs quickly enough. Second stage of the war. Concentrated strike. 4810 to 4815. Mad Murda finally arrived, leading his fleet from his battleship Skullcrackadaka, an impressive vessel which was over 10 kilometers long. He managed to get a hold of numerous Orc forces and direct them into the region of Ostensea Council. His concentrated attack fell upon the region, causing significant damage. His forces managed to enter territory of established septs, causing even more problems for the Coalition. However, despite his strong attack, few worlds actually fell to his strike. People of this region of space were well aware of Orc danger, and after the Third Coalition War, this region of space was well prepared to counter Orc attacks. Worlds there had specialized units that carried the knowledge of the war against the Orcs. Those 6 years saw brutal and grinding battles of numerous fronts, both on the ground and in the void. Orcs were attacking on a wide front, more happy with the fact of fighting itself rather than ensuring any substantial victory. Even though the fights were brutal, all invasions were pushed back. All Orc fleets were sooner or later forced out of the Coalition space. But Mad Murda was still alive and overall commander of the Orc forces in the south. After the failure to secure any grand victories in the ex-Council space, Mad Murda withdrew and then attacked far less defended region dominated by the Centra. The Coalition defenses there were far weaker, and so the Orc invasions proven to be far more devastating. It was also during this failure when some Orc warbosses split from the Mad Murda and made their way in different directions of space. Some focused on the Coalition, and some found new threats and challenges for them to enjoy. Third stage of the war. The Zaid War. 4816 to 4826. For an entire decade, the Orcs were ravaging the region of the Zaid Confederation, one of the newest member of the Coalition, with Centra species leading this region of space. 2 major worlds of Confederation fell, and even Sinanoi's sept was lost by the very start of the war, as orcs managed to overwhelm the coalition defenses in very short order. The young sept, that was mostly a trading post and open port for traders, was lacking deep defenses systems of old council space septs. Madmurda exploited the weak defenses and significantly less densely colonized region of space for his advantage, going around coalition blockades and striking exposed targets. Loss of entire sept world was devastating, as were the loss of multiple important worlds. Orcs gathered a lot of scrap from that. As such, their fleet and threat grew in size during that decade. Madmurda, however, was slowly losing his influence. Some orcs, war bosses, finding new targets of interest. Not a small part of orc force attempted to breach the Broken Heart, only to be swallowed whole by the Black Hole. One that moved faster than before, as if to intercept orcs, only to slow down and go back to its routine path after the fact. While very interesting for the Earthcast scientists, Coalition had no time to study this phenomenon, especially with more orc war bosses establishing their own groups outside Madmurda power structure. Zabdaka established kingdom near the Beast's Teeth and Beast's Eye, and was launching attacks on Coalition from there. It was a war boss that was unusually stable weird boy, being as good in punching as in farting lightning. It is rare for a weird boy to become a war boss, but this one managed to get a hold of enough orcs and zap enough of them with his power to get control over a good portion of the war. Another orc warboss was known as Dark Eye, an orc that settled near the Black Heart Bay, tipping his attacks on Old Council space. Dark Eye was another unusual orc because he was a commando warboss, and he was more tactical and cunning compared to other 2 rivals in the orc power structure in this region of space. With growing number of targets, Coalition Navy had problems rivaling growing numbers of orcs that were spread on the wide front, one which couldn't be reliably held. Especially because the Coalition in this region had 2 great, main leading naval commanders. Harivat, Hurricane, male admiral of strong desire of destruction, native to local septs, specialized with using of diverse vessels of Coalition, not only the Tau, but also their allies. The other one was Rai Ka Tai, Lightning Tide, a stoic female admiral from core regions of the Coalition, one that preferred bigger vessels and only those of Tau design. Those 2 were kind of anomaly by Coalition and especially Tau standards, because they couldn't stand each other at all. Those 2 didn't see eye to eye and were bitter rivals. Harivat preferred more aggressive, offensive doctrines, calling for eternally striking the orcs and bleeding them, when Raikatai was far more cautious and preferred to keep the naval forces in defense. Their rivalry was enhanced due to the fact that FOIGHT was supported by the local high-ranking representatives of Ethereals, while Reimagined was by the Ethereal Supreme Aun Tor, at least at the time. Their conflict and indecision led to multiple losses and finally the loss of entire Sept in one massive invasion that overwhelmed their regional defenses. FOIGHT led the counterattack and lost his life. The blame was put on Reimagined, who withheld her forces, not sending reinforcements to support fellow commander, seeing his actions as futile. Because of their rivalry and Reimagined actions, the second Sept was lost. The Taura fell to the orcs, with the breaking of coalition defenses lines there. This loss worsened the state of Aun Tor, who died a year later after Zervera fell in the north. Loss of 3 Septs was too much for him to bear. Even though his death wasn't yet here, he already lost much of his ability to rule. His successor, Aun D, already taking more and more control over the whole operation. Reimagined would lose her position as commander of naval fleets in the region and be demoted for her failures. Later she lost life to Orc Assassin, as it is stated in official records. Most likely, truth is that Aun D, new Ethereal Supreme, decided to erase her from pages of history so she could put her own chosen commander and wash her hands of her failure. Her choice was Seikai Otesuto, Tempest of Justice, a young, competent air-caste admiral from the core regions of the coalition, rough in his efficiency, skilled in commanding all types of vessels of the coalition, but well known for his readiness to sacrifice no-Tau vessels and their crews for the sake of gaining victory. Many other commanders of the Southern Front lost their lives by the hands of so-called Orc Assassins for their failure, and so that Aun D could place her chosen people in command of the entire front. Which made sense, because while Aun Tor, the Ethereal Supreme that started this war, wasn't a fan of other species or non-Tau species in the coalition, Aun D was straight up Tau supremacist, although she managed to hide it quite well. She was more than happy to sacrifice everyone who thought that other species of the coalition were on equal footing with the great Tau species. That's one of the reasons why so many commanders lost their lives, because they valued non-Tau species under their command. But there were few people who shared the view of Aun D in this regard. One of those people was Commander Shas Fan, Commander Firestorm. He was a rising star among the Firecast in the south. Similarly to Seikai Otesuto, he was of the core regions of the coalition and just as ruthless. He was responsible for evacuation of the Taura. However, the fact he focused on evacuating Tau personnel leaving numerous Tau non-civilians to death, was kept quiet. With those two great commanders who shared only the distaste of treating other species within the coalition as equals, she would continue campaign against the orcs, doing her best to score a proper victory. What is interesting is that other characters and commanders had potential of becoming heroes in this period and region of space. But this honor was denied to them because they weren't Tau. Among those commanders were Elion. He was a talented Centra Grand Force commander who was responsible of successfully evacuating multiple worlds of his people and stopping the orc invasion of Centra homeworld. After the fall of the Taura, the Zayt Confederation was basically cut off from the rest of the coalition. This man is the reason why Centra and Confederation managed to survive, managed to hold the line from the orcs for all the time they were cut off from the rest of the coalition. If something like this happened in the Imperium of Man, such person would be considered a living saint, because holding out from so many enemies for so long would be considered a miracle. And Elion most definitely went beyond all his duties, saving his people from obliteration. Of course, this survival wasn't only thanks to his ability to hold the orcs on the ground. Commander Aurelia Trifant was extremely talented naval commander of the Mechians, the Uphumans, also one of the newest additions to the coalition. She scored numerous victories against the orcs, despite the fact she was using one of the smaller fleets in the region. She was also responsible for creating or leading convoys with supplies to the Centra space. She led multiple convoys and missions as basically a blockade runner, breaking through orc defenses and lines with civilian convoys and giving as many reinforcements and resources to the Centra as it was physically possible. She was basically the second pillar, the second reason why Zayt Confederation managed to survive despite being cut off from the rest of the coalition. Another great commander was Duora, a Rehichu warrior that personally killed 3 war bosses by leading very unorthodox attacks at orcs' leaderships in multiple battles. He worked mostly in the south of the Southern Front, where among the old Osten Council space. He was leading attacks at the back lines, striking directly at the leaders and essential equipment of the orcs, like for example the Mech Boys workshops. But because Andy was a very racist ethereal supreme, and because those successes were, not in the defense of the core regions of the coalition, many of his accomplishments were unrecognized for a very long time. Another great known town commander was Hideo Ultia, a human naval commander that was responsible for destroying multiple smaller orc shipyards beyond the territory of the coalition space. He led a smaller fleet, similar to that of Aurelia Trifant, but when she was focusing on working within the coalition space, he brought the fight to the enemy, going behind the lines, striking at the supply chains of the orcs and mostly orc boys' bases. Well, the Meg boys' bases and their shipyards. He was again responsible for those actions, mostly in the region of Old Ostenelcy Council space. However, if there was someone who could be considered the greatest non-Tau commander from the Southern Front that was unrecognized by the General Coalition for a very long time, was Ul Reisi, a Zoat Grand Force commander that created a new doctrine known as Otoshi Adha, Pitfall Barrier. I will attempt to make some visualizations of those doctrine now on the screen so you can follow. This was a defensive doctrine where defenses would be set up in checkboard pattern. One position strong, one weak. This would allow the enemies to break intentionally weaker points and go into defensive kill zone, where later they could be surrounded by fast-moving units. In many ways, it was an evolution of Quayon doctrine. The Quayon, or the doctrine of the patient counter, is creating an intended way to lure the enemy and destroy them with overwhelming fire. However, with the orcs, sometimes it's hard to convince them to attack target that you want. So, Ulreisi, the Zoat commander, came up with a great answer to that problem. He created a pattern of strong points and weak points that allowed the hordes of the orcs to crash into his defenses, go into the kill zones, and potentially be cut off and slaughtered in detail, one by one. In terms of fighting the orcs, this was a great doctrine. I mean, for ground forces, it was perfect. Especially because this checkboard pattern could go as deep as you wanted, as much as resources and forces you had, that many lines of those defenses you could create. And so it was very hard to break it, because even if you broke from one hard point, one harder position, while painful, it still gave opportunity to create even bigger kill zone and cause even greater damage to the orcs. Ideal for dealing with the mass attacks of the orc boys. And some of you might think that with creating such effective doctrine, it would be hard to not recognize and venerate Ulreisi for his accomplishments. But here Audi couldn't allow a non-Tau to create a doctrine that a Tau would adopt and see as superior to their own. So the doctrine was wrongly attributed to Commander Firestorm by orders of Audi. Officially, for decades to come, people would think that Pitfall Barrier doctrine was created by Commander Firestorm and not this Zoat commander, because Audi was just a vengeful and racist cunt. All those heroes and many others achieved a lot during this period of time, but because of the Ethereal Supreme Auntor and later on D, their accomplishments were being systematically silenced and pushed aside. So the Tau commanders that were closer to the camp of Audi and the Tau supremacist faction among the Ethereals could rise to become heroes and legends among the coalition. This was a great mistake and caused significant losses on the coalition side, because those commanders, those non-Tau commanders and Tau commanders who valued non-Tau opinion cut a point. They saw weaknesses and wanted to fight against it, but Audi many times caused their death by sending orc assassins. And because of that, worlds fell. Like, it was disastrous. As you could probably figure out, killing your own commanders who know what they're doing isn't really optimal. Not optimal at all. If you feel that my point isn't, well, convincing enough, I propose you to check the history of the Soviet Union and what happened after Stalin ordered a purge among the officer corps of the Red Army. And that was before Operation Barbarossa. If you know how well the start of Operation Barbarossa went, I assure you that killing your officers during war, during the orc offensive towards your core regions, wasn't smart. Wasn't smart at all. Many commanders were lost because of Audi hubris. But some would be saved by the hidden presence of Trazen the Infinite in the years to come. Fourth stage of the war. Race to the core. 4827 to 4830. With clear breach in the coalition defenses, orcs poured into the coalition space in great numbers. Madmurda declared that he will reach all the way to the Tau core worlds, something that wasn't unnoticed by the coalition and the Ethereal Supreme. Aun Tor, the Ethereal Supreme that lived since the beginning of the war, died by the end of 4827. With the information of the fall of Zervera, as well as information that the orcs were pushing towards the region of second sphere of expansion, and with plans to take the Tau, their homeworld itself, it was too much to bear. New Ethereal Supreme, Aun D, redirected the majority of coalition forces to protect the core regions of the coalition, weakening other fronts. More and more worlds fell under siege or were conquered by the orcs. Thankfully, orcs seem to find more targets outside the coalition itself, and fronts generally held, mostly thanks to actions of unsung heroes of the Southern Front, the non-Tau commanders. Madmurda regained influence over the Wa, which allowed him to guide it deeper and deeper towards the coalition space. Sept, Hreal have been attacked, but managed to hold thanks to its powerful fleet and orbital defenses. However, the orcs moved forward either way. The Vogt homeward, Faren, have been attacked alongside Viorla and Elisier Septs. All worlds of the second sphere of expansion. The orcs finally managed to reach that deep into the core of the coalition. They were merely one step from getting to the Tau and the region of the first sphere of expansion, a region of space that was untouched by war for now thousands of years. And now orcs were just barely reaching the borders of this region. Territories of Centra species were completely cut off in this period of time, and by the orders of Aundi, numerous worlds were bombarded into ash to kill orcs and deny them scrap and resources. Some of them were worlds that were prospects for future colonies, and some were already colonized. But she was ready to sacrifice them for the sake of securing the Tau core regions and keeping herself safe. In the meantime, both Dark Eye and Zabdaka both were pushing further into coalition territories, threatening multiple septs and straining the coalition defenses. It was by the end of 4829, during the Great Battle of Yorla, that Commander Firestorm managed to strike down Madmurda on the planet's surface. The tip of the Orc offensive towards the core regions of the coalition was finally broken apart. But numerous Orc war bosses rose up in the place of Madmurda, starting to create their own small empires for themselves. Thankfully, the death of Madmurda wasn't the only great information for the coalition at the time, because coalition managed to establish contact with Sitorians, who were fighting against the orcs' menace as well. The coalition managed to establish diplomatic relations and military alliance between the coalition and the Sion Empire. But now there is a question. Who the hell are Sitorians? Sitorians were technologically advanced techno-zealot empire of around 40 worlds and numerous space stations that spread alongside the Damocles Rift, creating a long state of quite significant size. Their belief was something similar to the two-faced god that was the belief of Zoats in the past. Although what is important, by all accounts, Zoats didn't have contact with Sitorians. So either fate decided that those two species would come up to very similar realizations in terms of connecting and combining faith and technology, or something else influenced the Sitorians, and maybe Zoats themselves. What is also very important to know is that Sitorians aren't singular species, at least not anymore. Their original form isn't known. It was purposely destroyed with information. In this era, they seem as a singular race, but this is very hard to discern because there's a lot of gene editing and cybernetics in their society because of their religion. By the looks of it, few Xenos, maybe humans, most likely beastmen of some kind, created this alliance based on faith and started to splitting each other's DNA alongside their species, creating this new species that was very reliant on technology and genetical manipulation of their own genes. Their faith was based on idea of perfecting yourself and others through technology, both genetics and cybernetics. The Sion Empire was a theocratic monarchy, where the king was both the monarch and the prophet of God of Progress, as they called it. The Centaurians were attacked by the orcs, but to their own luck, the orcs were mostly focused on the coalition, seeing that there was a bigger fight and more scrap to find there. Another important defense of Centaurians and Sion Empire was the fact that they were very close to the Damocles Rift, which meant that their region of space there were more anomalies there, and the orcs had difficulty navigating that region of space and getting to the Sion Empire worlds. However, Centaurians weren't idiots, and they knew that if coalition fails to stop the orcs, they were next on the menu. So they agreed to cooperation and fighting together against the orcs. It was the death of Madmurda and help of Centaurians that allowed the coalition to send some reinforcements to the north that would lead to victory over Kampenheimer and Campageddon, which started to, change the course of the war in the northern front. That, of course, doesn't mean that the southern front was in good shape. It wasn't. The death of Warlord wasn't as significant here as it would be in the northern front. Rather than to totally fall apart and fall upon each other, here orcs started to create kingdoms for themselves. Sixth stage of a war. The Orc Kingdoms, from 4831 to 4833. With Madmurda's death and splitting of Orc War between numerous Orc war bosses, Coalition gained a chance to take a deep breath. The decision was made to send reinforcements to the north in hope of taking down Krampageddon and securing the entire region, so that could be ensured steady line of supplies to the south, which paid off. The victory over Campageddon allowed far more resources to be redirected to the south for the coming struggle in the continuation of this brutal war. Additionally, Dark Eye disappeared without notice. He was just gone, with Coalition having no clue where the hell he could gone. It was just... and he's gone. One of the major war bosses in the entire region just gone. Zabdaka, on the other hand, would find his end in the Battle of Tashvar, not long after Madmurda, his force breaking into few kingdoms. So, all three major orc warlords from the start of the war were gone. The coalition had now help of Centaurians that allowed for coordination of more strikes against the orcs and spreading out the orc forces. So there was some hope on the horizon. In 3 years since the death of Madmurda, 7 orc kingdoms were established, each and every one a threat to a coalition, But as they were broken apart, it gave Coalition a chance to eliminate the war bosses individually, one by one. And now on the map you can see all kingdoms and all war bosses. The Backbreaker, Snaga Godscar, Skullsmack War Treka, Balgor Blitzschucht, Orknard Kurz, Tooth Collecta, and Aren Bonefist. None of them were really a warlord material, but as kings of their own little kingdoms, they were doing quite fine. At least for a time. The 7th stage of a war has a very appropriate name. Struggle. 4834 to 4847. And the name says it all. It was over a decade-long struggle against the Orc kingdoms that spread out and caused difficulties with supplies and communication. Even with death and disappearance of initial 3 major warlords, Coalition struggled to keep Orcs in check. Even with Orcs fighting each other, the defeat of or unification between Orcs was still a possibility. 6 long years lasted of desperate defense and holding the line, until 4840, when in the north they managed to kill Krampenheimer, and far more resources could be sent to the southern front, and starting to slowly pushing Orcs out. Some of you might be confused that with the death of the warlords, this shouldn't be as difficult. But remember how long the war lasted here and how many Orcs there were here. They spread out to just ridiculous number. And there wasn't really any good way to deal with them. There were just too many of them to kill. Coalition barely managed to stop them from getting to the Tau itself, the home world of the leaders of the entire coalition. And they simply didn't have resources or people to strike back. This age was especially difficult for Centra, who got completely surrounded, and more than few Orcs decided that now it was a good time to try to conquer them, and they barely managed to hold the line, mostly because Orcs were more focused on killing each other than them, but it was just barely holding the line. Thankfully, the madness of Milky Way galaxy for once decided to be on the side of a coalition. Because in the darkness there are many dangerous things, many dark things, many corrupting things. And despite of what some Orcs believe, they aren't immune to the influence of this darkness. The 8th stage of the war, the Orc Civil War, from 4848 to 4850. More than a few of you might be confused, because war is natural state for the Orcs. How the hell do you get a civil war among the Orcs if war is all they want? Well, there is a piece of the lore a very old one that was retconned more than once, but one I very deeply enjoy. And well, I am not the only one who likes to bring it back. Those who watch the almighty and all-powerful Voldemort might start to figure out what I'm talking about. Oh, yes, my darlings. The Dark Eye, one of the orc warlords, returned, but now he was calling himself Dark Eye Hork. Yes, the great warlord that disappeared without notice returned as someone corrupted by the Blood God. And he didn't arrive alone, because by his side was another orc, Plague Smiler, one corrupted by Nurgle. Both of those corrupted orc groups arrived from the region of Black Heart's Bay and started to attacking the orcs and their back lines, and capturing a great number of their territories, which caused orcs to turn their attention to them and fight against the, heretics, the damned orcs that weren't orc enough to pray to Gork and Mork. And I assure you that the coalition was very confused why they suddenly weren't as much of priority target for the orcs. When they saw and made contact with the Red and Plague orcs for the first time, they were even more confused. But with orcs fighting and killing each other, and great victories in the north, majority of Northern Front forces alongside of their commanders could be deployed to the south. And that can mean only one thing. The coalition was able to strike back. 9th stage of the war. Heroes of the North strike hard. From 4851 to 4860. The arrival of Northern heroes changed things quickly. Seikai Otesuto, Tempest of Justice, and Commander Shasfan, Commander Firestorm, were good enough to stop the orcs' advance and make some small gains, but with how wide the front was and how they ignored good tactics and strategies from non-Tau commanders, they had no chance of scoring a big-scale victories. That changed when veterans of the North arrived to the South, being redirected to the region of Old Council space. With orcs distracted fighting against Korks and Plague orcs, they pushed them out of the coalition space within 2 years. Muntsu took over the defenses of the entire front line, and Haresh made sure that targets of priority would be taken down. Talented non-Tau commanders were recognized and prized by Muntsu and other heroes of Northern Front. As one could suspect, Aundi was furious, but she agreed to avant-hack and Ransai plan for offensive in the northern part of the front. After all, they succeed and gained a lot of influence among Ethereals, High Caste Council, and members of the coalition. She didn't really have a way of denying them, which is a funny thing to think about, that Ethereal Supreme, even though on the top, doesn't possess absolute power. In 4854, their smart offensive managed to reconquer the Taura Sept, as of all present they had experience of doing so. Centra, after 2.5 decades of being surrounded and struggling to survive, were finally saved. 25 bloody years of being besieged on all sides. In moments as this one, it's the ideology of the Tau and the coalition at large that every colony should be self-sustaining, have ability to sustain its own population, makes a lot of sense. And the value of this doctrine of colonization was proven true, because if coalition was working in colonization as the Imperium of Man, this region would be already dead, like starved. 25 years of being cut off from reinforcements and supplies would most likely put even a hive world in danger. But not here. 25 years, and although bloody and hellish experience, the Centra managed to survive. Backbreaker was pushed out of the coalition space, forcing him to move further north and focus on the Mekian space. 2 years later, Sianoi was captured, thanks to coordinated strikes against the Orcs between the Sitorians and the coalition. Sitorians managed to secure a part of Orc space and finally establish a stable supply line to the coalition. Before that, all communication was made through either blockade runners or psychers who tried to communicate on long distances. Snaga Godskar was killed in 4860, and his kingdom was erased from existence. In this year, all kingdoms that were within coalition space were destroyed. There were small pockets of resistance and small orc fleets, but majority of the orcs were forced out of coalition territories. At the same time, Horks, or Hornate Orcs, reached coalition borders, which started the new stage in the war, as the orcs consolidated their forces to face both the coalition and their heretical brothers. 10th stage of the war. The Twisted War. From 4861 to 4866. This was a period of very intense fighting, but also of things that before were unheard of and even hard to imagine by the members of the coalition. In those 6 years, Southern Front was divided into 3 different theaters. The Mekian Front, which was the further north, the Sitorian Front, the western part, and so-called Twisted Front, that was the most in the south. Let's start with the Mekian Front. The Orc war boss, Backbreaker, decided to attack Mekian space, with Meku, their homeworld, as the main target. Aundi decided to take over command of that front alongside Seikai Otesuto, Tempest of Justice, and Commander Firestorm. She believed that with this action, with taking to the front personally in this region of space, she would regain much of her influence and power. This trio was fighting against the Orcs, but the Greenskins managed to organize themselves far better than any other group of the orcs at the time. Despite the fact that this orc force wasn't the biggest, it was the most organized and had the most dense population of, well, cohesive forces of orcs. Aundi, with her commanders, managed to hold the line, but it was very difficult. Thankfully for her, and the Mechians especially, in 4865, Ransai arrived to the front after achieving success alongside Avant-Hak and the Sitorians against Skull-Smack War Tracker, which allowed to divert coalition forces to the northern front, which was needed because Backbreaker managed to reach the major Mechian worlds. Soon after their arrival, there was a decisive battle of Dai Chandra, Moon of Eternity. Moon that was orbiting Meku itself. It was very well colonized world, well, moon in this case, with energy domes over the colonies that were growing on top of the dead moon surface. It was there where the final brutal battle of this region of space was waged. Backbreaker and Firestorm were dueling one-on-one in the ruins of the domed cities. Aundi and Seikai Otesuto were near the surface of the moon in the capital vessel of a coalition, one of the first vessels that could be considered a battleship class in the coalition history, named Greater Duty. Firestorm was fighting the orcs on the ground, and Aundi with Seikai Otesuto were dueling and fighting against the orc fleet that was attempting to breach the coalition defenses and reach the Meku itself. Ransai and Avant-Hak were present, but were ordered to keep the orc reinforcements away, as to allow Aundi and her two puppets to achieve the great victory that she so much desired. However, in the final moments of the battle, a great green light blinded everything and everyone present, and good portion of the moon, battling fleets, Aundi, her two puppets, the warlord boss, Backbreaker, all were gone without a trace. There was chaos for a moment, but Ransai and Avant-Hak managed to regain the control and in one final brutal push destroy all the orcs and force them out of the system, force them to retreat with the tail between their legs. For many, the Battle of Dai Chandra was one of the greatest tragedies in the coalition history. It was first time in the coalition history that Ethereal Supreme lost life in a battle, that her guards, her fleet, the coalition itself failed to protect the Ethereal Supreme. However, everyone, outside of two people that were present, were fooled, because Aundi wasn't dead. The green light that eradicated entire fleets and ate up a good portion of the moon wasn't caused by some mad orc weapon that, in typical orc fashion, went rogue and destroyed both the target and its user. It was all doing of Trazen the Infinite. Ransai kept his word, and the great collector of Nikolaic dynasty had a piece for his collection. The great battle of Dai Chandra, one waged both in the void and on the ground, with great duel between the commander Firestorm and Backbreaker Warlord, with Aundi, Ethereal Supreme, and Seikai Otesuto within the great battleship of the coalition, the first that was ever created. It wasn't easy to take such great piece of the void and the moon into his collection, but he was more than happy with the results, because that was quite a piece for his collection. With Aondi and her 2 puppets gone, Ransai and Avant-Hak took overall command of this front and started to push orcs further and further, to the point that in fear or terror or whatever happened with the orcs, they started to retreat and escape towards the Bay of Silence, where they would meet their end, but not by the hand of the coalition. But about that later. Let's talk about the Sitorian front. The battle there was waged between the 4861 to 4865. Ransai, Avant-Hak managed to totally break the orc forces of Skullsmack Wartraka. Commander of overall Sitorian forces, the Crown Prince Ezero, established good relations with both commanders. And with good understanding of each other's abilities, even though their forces weren't as big as those in the Mekian or Twisted Front, they managed to coordinate great offensives and simply dismember the orc forces piece by piece. Additionally, it was Ezero that managed to take down the orc warboss himself, which gained him a lot of respect among the coalition forces. Of course, with Orc Kingdom falling apart, it wasn't taken fully by the coalition or the Sitorians. A good piece was taken by Balgor Blitzschut, another warboss. After all, with the previous warboss gone, his territories were there just for a taking. And finally, let's discuss the Twisted Front. Name that for a singular reason. Orcs made contact with the coalition, asking for an alliance. And some of you might think, what the fuck is going on? Why the fuck would orcs start talking with the coalition? Like this doesn't make sense? No. Reminder that it's not unheard of for the orcs to propose cooperation with other forces if there was a greater threat or more important enemy. Orcs cooperating with Imperials to fight the Tyranids isn't unheard of. In this case, it was more of religious reason, because the Khornate orcs were doing quite a lot of damage to the orcs. And they were very much pissed that those not orky orcs were beating them so hard. And they thought that the main reason why they had, this advantage was because the coalition was beating them in the back. So, with orc logic, it was we need to cramp the red orcs, but we can't do that if we are cramped in the back by the coalition. So, let's cooperate to deal with the red orcs, and then we will get back to the proper fighting between the proper warriors. The Balgor Blitzschut and Arin Bonefist were first to make a deal and ally with each other, and after they succeeded, fighting against both the Khornate orcs and Plague orcs, they started to make greater moves. The fight against the Plague Orcs was especially easy because the Coordinate Orcs turned against their Chaos Brothers and helped the Orcs slaughter them. So the Plague Orcs were no more. So, 2 normal Orcs, the Coordinate Orcs, and the Coalition. And the Blitzrook and Bonefist made contact with the Coalition, proposing cooperation until they deal with the Coordinate Orcs. Mun-Tzu, the overall commander in this part of the front, agreed, seeing those new Orcs as more problematic. Why did she see the Red Orcs as more problematic? Again, she was more open and more friendly towards non-Tau commanders. Some of them were psychic Xenos. Some of them had deeper understanding of the Dark Gods. So it was decided that the Coordinate Orcs were more problematic in the long run than normal Orcs, simply because the Orcs themselves couldn't corrupt society of a Coalition. The Coordinate Orcs had a very small chance of doing so. So Mun-Tzu agreed. Haresh was of course pissed about it, as basically everyone else, but everyone knew that this alliance won't last. It wasn't even really an alliance, it was more of a temporary non-aggression pact. The Orcs were focused fully on the Coordinate Orcs. The Coalition didn't attack normal Orcs and focused on the Coordinate Orcs, but at the same time, they were building up their defenses, making sure that when this cooperation ends, they will be ready to deal with the Orcs in a proper way. In 4866, all 3 war bosses and Haresh found themselves on a battlefield of Narhalin IV, a world which was a home base of Coordinate Orcs, and a world which was attacked at the same time by all 3 cooperating groups, the 2 Orcs and the Coalition. And as they found each other on the battlefield, they realized that only one would go out alive, as this was a perfect setting to kill all of the rivals. And so the great FOIGHT fight commenced. 1 Coordinate Orc, 2 Orc war bosses, and 1 extremely skilled Kroot commander. And thanks to his experience, cunning, weapons, and gadgets, it was Haresh who came on top, with 3 heads of Orc lords in his hands. However, this victory didn't come without a price. Haresh suffered a mortal wound and died not long after his great victory. His last words were, "Lance, shame you weren't here to see it." With their war boss's death, the Orcs fell apart and on one another, many turning against the Coalition, but Mun-Tzu's defenses held. Thanks to well-prepared defensive lines and great usage of the Pitfall Defenses doctrine, the Orcs couldn't break the Coalition lines, and rather than fight this unfair battle, they focused on killing each other, trying to gain the position of a war boss. As their attention turned away from the Coalition, Commander Mun-Tzu Now 68-year-old Tau, female commander, smiled, seeing as orcs fell upon one another without any orc in place to take over the command of their forces. She already knew that the orcs wouldn't be able to unite anytime soon. This day she declared that the victory was only a matter of time. With her service done, she fell asleep and never woke again. 11th stage of the war, the Green Purge, 4867 to 4875. All major war bosses were dead. The orcs were in disarray, but the coalition also suffered quite significant losses. Loss of Ethereal Supreme alongside her two chosen commanders was painful for the coalition overall. Her violent sacrifice, however, was immortalized. The loss was put to the orcs that most likely some kind of weapon they were preparing turned against both them and their targets, bringing end to the Ethereal Supreme. They had no idea, as I said, that it was Trazen the Infinite that decided to snatch entire battlefield for himself. Loss of Haresh and Munsu were similarly painful. But not as painful as one could suspect. Haresh, while venerated as the leader of the cult overall, did appoint successors. He knew that he would most likely meet his end on a battlefield, and he prepared his people for someone else to take over. Munsu did the very same thing. She was old, very old by the Tau standards. And with her age, she managed to mentor more than a few very good commanders. And now, her successors, with proper strategies and lessons in mind, stood up and took over the work of their mentor, honoring her memory through their own perfect service. Soon enough, things started to change. New Ethereal Supreme became Aun Sai, a member of more moderate faction compared to previous Ethereals. Aun Tor and Aun D were both of Tau's supremacist faction, but their failure caused this faction to slowly lose influence. The same way the heroes of the Northern Front that proven that doctrines and tactics of non-Tau commanders were very well made and effective, changed the perspective on this faction a lot. Aun Sai was far more moderate and friendly faction of Ethereals that actually cared about the members of the coalition. He was far more reasonable and less tyrannical compared to the previous Ethereals. He also possessed a great talent of recognizing skills of others and having ability to put them in the right place to do the most good for the coalition. This new style of leadership brought him a lot of respect and influence among the members of the coalition in a very short period of time. Avant Hak and Ran Sai both became his advisors, with Avant Hak becoming overall commander of the naval forces of the coalition and Ran Sai becoming overall commander of ground forces of the coalition. Some of you might be surprised that an Ethereal would take Ran Sai, someone who was clearly not a friend of Ethereals, as an overall commander of the ground forces. But that was a difference between Aun Tor, Aun Di and Aun Sai. Aun Sai put the good of the coalition above his own personal feelings. He didn't care that Ran Sai didn't like Ethereals. He only cared that Ran Sai would do the most good for the coalition as overall commander of the coalition ground forces. Aun Sai also appointed many new commanders, many of them being non-Tau, to the high positions in the overall command structure of the coalition military, balancing things out compared to the time when Aun Di put basically Tau-only commanders on all levels of command throughout the coalition. With new overall commanders by his side and him on the throne, Aun Sai began something called the Green Purge. It was a series of battles and engagements where greatest concentrations of orcs were targeted and eliminated, with idea of decapitating the threat once and for all. Mass orbital bombardment and mobility of armies and fleets was crucial in this period of time. Avanthak and Ran Sai pushed the orcs into the Silent Bay within few years, but as they entered the bay itself, with clear intention of eradicating orcs, they found orc fleets dead in the void, and as they entered their ships, they found out that all life on ships was turned into dust. It was concerning, but cause was given to some kind of anomaly. Coalition forces retreated, leaving listening and observation posts near the bay's entrance. They had no idea what could possibly erase millions upon millions of orcs with such efficiency, but they didn't really want to find out. At least for now. In the highest chambers of coalition government, it was deemed unwise to seek a new potential threat before they dealt with the orcs. Coalition and Sitorians managed to completely wipe out orcs in the region between their borders, creating a semi-secured region of space. In the south, Coalition pushed slowly forward, mostly allowing orcs to kill each other and preserving their own forces. Orcs became completely divided, more focused on fighting each other than the coalition. Even Khornate orcs fell upon each other, giving coalition even greater advantage. 12th stage of the war. The Cleansing. 4876 to 4885. Slow and steady finishing of the job. Years of infighting brought end to the Khornate orcs, and the rest of orc empires and kingdoms were forced to flee the region completely or hide. Some small pockets remained, but they were broken and weakened to the point that they weren't a real threat to the coalition. Coalition managed to take care of orc populations that managed to hide within their borders as well. Those orc population centers were eradicated, and security of the coalition was ensured. With the war slowly coming to an end, it was clear that orcs would remain a threat to the coalition for generations to come. Small pockets of them remained in the void, establishing a semi-stable regions of orc space that would be under constant observation by the coalition, as the destruction of those regions infected by the orcs was deemed too difficult at the time. There were three main regions that remained under orc control: the Beast's Eye, the Beast's Teeth, and the Beast's Bay, all of which were either too far to fight in an efficient way, or orcs were using anomalies to hide from the coalition. Of course, those three biggest infestations of orcs would remain a problem and a pain in the side of the coalition to the end of time. But this war allowed orcs to spread out in basically every direction, so the orc infestation was basically everywhere in the sector, but it wasn't at the scale to be a threat to the coalition, at least as long as the population was kept under control and they didn't unite. It was by the end of this period when Avant-Hak passed away at the astonishing age of 85, one of the oldest living aircasts in the coalition history, at least at the time. It was a symbolic ending to the war, before Avant-Hak was born at the very same day when the information about arrival of the orc fleets reached her Septworld of Holos. And the moment of her death was officially stated to be the end of the war, when it was deemed that the coalition was safe from the orc menace, at least for now. A poetic death for someone like her. Well, my darlings, this is it. The entirety of the 5th Coalition War. Without a doubt, the most devastating war in the Coalition history. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, the whole thing. Tell me if you enjoyed the story. Do you want to see something new, something more? Do you want to ask about something specific that happened during this period of time? Or maybe, what are my plans for the future? The next episode will be the conclusion of the 5th Coalition War. What happened after the war was won? What was accomplished? What great changes came to the coalition? And the end of the story of Commander Ransai. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed. Now, my dear listeners, remember, wherever you are, whatever you do, try to enjoy yourself while you can. I wish you most critical day. Ta-ta!